And greetings, boys and girls around the world. The lefties who believe in global warming say there's no such thing as the Little Ice Age, which was a cold snap that at least affected Europe and England about 200, 250 years ago. Yet Charles Dickens wrote his stories during that time, toward the end of the Little Ice Age, in which he spoke of bitter winters and heavy snows in England, which inspired his story, The Christmas Carol, about a fellow named Scrooge who wouldn't help the poor until he was visited by a ghost. Maybe it was a nightmare, rattling chains, and gave him an attitude adjustment. And so the next morning, Christmas morning, Scrooge woke up in a different frame of mind and began to express generosity and a spirit of fellowship and cooperation with his neighbors that he had previously scorned. He was the fellow that said, "Bah, humbug." How could Dickens have written that, depicting a London covered with snow, if there was no snow? Well, as a matter of fact, now this is anecdotal, I can't prove it, but in London on the Thames River, winter fairs were held on the frozen Thames River, which froze to such an extent that an elephant could walk on the ice without breaking it. And yet it has never frozen since. A frozen Thames River with an elephant standing there in the snow, and it is not frozen since. Well, this is all poppycock. Bah, humbug. It's never happened. But if it did, hypothetically, in our imaginations, we might conceive of the idea that the earth was colder 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and it has warmed since. And if it had warmed since the time that Charles Dickens wrote The Christmas Carol, you might expect the temperature of the atmosphere to be rising. You might expect the ice caps on the North Pole to be melting ever so slightly, growing and receding and growing and receding, but with a trend toward less ice. And you might expect the oceans to be ever so slightly warming up. In fact, the records we have indicate that in the past 150 years, the ocean has warmed ever so slightly. But the global warmist religion has as its doctrine that only human-produced CO2 causes the atmosphere to warm, and they say that ever since the Industrial Revolution, which happened about this time, in the same time frame that I earlier spoke of, beginning with the time of Charles Dickens and his famous story, The Christmas Carol, who said, "Bah, humbug." He was visited by the ghost of Christmas past, and the story takes place in a wintertime London covered in snow. Did it snow last winter? A little bit. But how about 10 and 20 years ago? Do you remember a lot of snow in London? Do you remember the Thames River freezing over? Now, zoom forward to the year 2013, and next year, 2014 and 2015. Suppose you live in a community that has used up all its electrical generating capacity and you need to build an additional power plant. The EPA, under Obama, says, yes, you can build another power plant so that everybody can have plenty of electricity as they have in the past. Yes, you can build your power plant just so long as you capture the CO2 emitted from the burning of coal, which is used to heat water, to produce steam, to turn a generator, a turbine connected to a generator. They've got these plants so super clean now, when you look at the smokestack of one of these plants today, you see nothing coming out the smokestack. It's that clean. You see nothing. And there'll be a cooling tower used to cool water, and it'll be producing a little bit of water vapor. Modern day power plants create no pollution, but only CO2 and water vapor, which is the result of perfect, complete combustion. Automobiles are getting to the point where they put out almost nothing but CO2 and water vapor. Power plants today are clean, but Obama, through his EPA, and if you'll think about it, Obama is the head of the executive branch of the government, not the legislative branch. In fact, our Constitution says all legislative powers will be vested in a Congress consisting of the Senate and the House of Representatives, all legislative powers. And yet, some bureaucrat appointed by some president, misguided, uninformed, misinformed, can create by fiat legislation that says power plants must capture CO2. Well, this will add to your bill. You will pay for this when you pay for your electricity. And this idea that the power plants must sequester, capture all the CO2 and dispose of it some way, a hole in the ground, I suppose, pumping it down into the ground, I suppose. I don't know if that's practical, and I don't know what it'll cost. But this is based on the very flimsy premise, a false premise, that CO2 drives temperature, when in fact it's the opposite. When temperature increases, the oceans exhale CO2. But the CO2 is not enough to substantially trap heat. Water vapor being the most potent greenhouse gas, which stays basically the same, except in warmer climates there's slightly more water vapor. But nevertheless, the heat manages to escape. The added heat is not the result of heat being trapped by greenhouse gases. It's obviously the additional heat provided by the sun, which is the reason we are no longer in the Little Ice Age depicted by Charles Dickens' story, The Christmas Carol.